Tonight, we descend into the heavy, shimmering depths of the periodic table, drifting toward an element that has beguiled and poisoned humanity for as long as we have known how to dig into the earth. We are looking for the silver ghost, the liquid mirror, the heavy water that refuses to wet the hand. It is a substance of profound contradictions, a metal that flows like a river, a solid that vanishes into invisible vapor, a medicine that cures by killing, and a tool that extracts gold while rotting the mind of the holder. To hold a vial of mercury is to feel a strange, impossible weight, a density that feels almost magnetic, dragging the hand toward the floor as the silver fluid swirls with a viscosity that defies the logic of water. It is beautiful, seductive, and terrifyingly toxic, a silent assassin that slips through the blood-brain barrier to unmake the very architecture of the self. Yet for thousands of years, we bathed in it, drank it, and painted our most sacred objects with its blood-red ore. This is the story of Quicksilver, the living metal, and the silent, madness-inducing price we paid for its mastery. Before there were empires, before there were alchemists dreaming of eternal life, there was only the geology of the deep earth, grinding and churning in the dark adolescence of the planet. Mercury is a traveler, a cosmic fugitive born in the violent hearts of dying stars, blasted across the vacuum of space to become trapped within the molten crust of the forming earth. Unlike iron or copper, which seeks stability in oxidized rust, Mercury is a restless spirit, a noble metal that prefers isolation, yet it found a partner in the volcanic hellscape of the prehistoric world: sulfur. In the subterranean veins, where magma cooled and geothermal waters hissed through fractured rock, mercury atoms bound themselves to sulfur atoms in a passionate, permanent embrace, crystallizing into a mineral of startling, impossible redness. This is cinnabar. It is the primary ore of Mercury, a rock that looks as though it has been dipped in fresh arterial blood, heavy and cold, waiting in the limestone fractures of places that would one day be known as Spain, Slovenia, and China. For millions of years, these veins of crystallized blood lay dormant in the dark, a chemical battery of potential madness waiting for the first primate hand to strike it with a stone. The discovery was likely an accident of curiosity, a moment of tactile wonder in the Neolithic twilight when a human hand first lifted a chunk of cinnabar and was startled by its unnatural specific gravity. It is a stone that feels deceptively heavy, a dense object that tricks the brain's expectation of weight, signaling that something powerful and rare resides within the red lattice. When crushed, the cinnabar does not fade. Instead, it crumbles into a powder of shocking vibrancy, a red so intense, so visceral, that early humans immediately associated it with the essence of life itself: blood. We can imagine the scene in the flickering light of a Paleolithic cave, where the shaman or the artist grinds the red stone between mortar and pestle, inhaling the faint, metallic dust that tastes of copper and death. They did not know they were liberating a neurotoxin. They saw only the color of vitality, the flush of the cheek, the spill of the hunt. They mixed this dust with animal fat to create vermilion, a pigment that would stain the bones of the dead in burials from the Levant to the Andes, a ritualistic attempt to grant the deceased a second, blood-red life in the darkness of the grave, unaware that the substance they used to honor the dead was potent enough to kill the living. But the true magic, the alchemy that would shackle humanity to this poison for millennia, occurred when the red stone was cast into the fire. It is a transformation of almost biblical wonder. When the blood-red cinnabar is heated, the sulfur burns away, reacting with the oxygen to form a choking gas, leaving behind the naked mercury. But the mercury does not melt like copper or iron, it sweats. It emerges from the rock as a vapor, a ghost escaping the corpse of the stone, rising up to find a cool surface where it condenses not into a solid, but into brilliant, trembling droplets of liquid silver. To the ancient mind, seeing a dry red rock bleed liquid silver was a miracle of the highest order, a defiance of natural law. This was hydrargyrum, water silver, a substance that captured the reflection of the observer, a perfect, unblemished mirror that rippled with the slightest breath. It was matter in a state of hesitation, caught between the solid earth and the fluid sea, and in this liminal state, our ancestors saw the potential for magic, for transmutation, and for the bridging of worlds between the physical and the spiritual. The extraction of this metal became one of the earliest and most hazardous industries of the ancient world, centered largely around the massive, bleeding wound in the earth at Almudena, in what is now Spain. The mines of Almudena are the largest concentration of liquid mercury on the planet, a geological anomaly that has supplied the world's craving for quicksilver for over 2,000 years. In the ancient era, to be sent to the mines of Almudena was not merely a sentence of labor, it was a slow, trembling execution. The galleries were hot, poorly ventilated, and thick with the dust of crushed cinnabar and the invisible, odorless vapor of free mercury. The miners, often slaves or prisoners of war, would begin to exhibit the classic, terrifying symptoms of heavy metal poisoning. The loosening of teeth, the uncontrollable shaking of the limbs known as the tremors, and a creeping, paranoid madness that dissolved the personality. Yet the demand for the pigment and the metal was insatiable. The Romans, who would later industrialize this death trap, held vermilion in such high esteem that on feast days, the face of the statue of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill was painted red with cinnabar dust, a divine mimicry of the blood sacrifice, bringing the king of gods to life with the pulverized ore of the underworld. This duality, the beauty of the product and the horror of its production, defined the early relationship between humanity and Mercury. It was the color of emperors and gods, adorning the frescoes of Pompeii and the lacquerware of the Han dynasty, yet it was harvested by men who coughed up their lungs and shook until they could no longer hold a spoon. The substance was woven into the fabric of superstition. In ancient China, liquid mercury was thought to be the key to immortality, a substance that, because it did not decay or tarnish, could impart its eternal nature to the human body if consumed. This tragic logic led to the consumption of immortality elixirs composed of mercury and crushed jade, potions that promised eternal life but delivered slow, agonizing death. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, is said to lie in a tomb surrounded by rivers of flowing mercury, a map of his empire traced in the toxic metal, driven by mechanical pumps to flow for eternity, a final, silent testament to the belief that this silver fluid was the blood of the earth, capable of preserving power even beyond the suffocating grip of death. As we moved from the Stone Age into the Age of Metals, Mercury's role shifted from purely ritualistic to functional, becoming a tool of amalgamation. The ancients discovered that this liquid metal had a voracious appetite for gold. If you ground up rock containing flecks of gold and mixed it with mercury, the quicksilver would devour the gold, dissolving it into a buttery silver paste, separating the precious metal from the worthless dross. By simply heating this paste, the mercury would boil away, leaving behind pure, shining gold. This process, simple and elegant, became the engine of ancient economies, allowing for the extraction of gold from low-grade ores that were otherwise useless. But in doing so, it released thousands of tons of mercury vapor into the atmosphere, the first great chemical assault on the biosphere. The smiths and jewelers who performed this magic often went mad, their brains slowly saturated by the invisible fumes of their trade, a professional hazard that was whispered about in the souks and workshops of the ancient world, a curse that befell those who tried to compel the earth to give up its treasures too easily. The appetite of the Roman Empire was not merely for land or gold, but for the spectacle of dominion, and mercury became the fuel for a specific, lethal kind of vanity that radiated from the center of Rome to the bleeding edges of the known world. As the legions marched, the demand for cinnabar to paint the walls of villas and the faces of triumphant generals soared, turning the mines of Almudena into a subterranean purgatory that was whispered about with dread in every corner of the Mediterranean. It was here, in the suffocating dark, that we see the first recorded industrial attempt to mitigate the poison, a primitive collision between human fragility and toxic necessity. Pliny the Elder, the great chronicler of natural history, noted that the workers who polished the Cinnabar wore masks made of bladder skin, a translucent, ghostly membrane stretched over their faces in a desperate, futile attempt to filter the deadly dust. They looked like specters, faceless and doomed, peering through the dried organs of animals while their own organs slowly petrified from within. It was an acknowledgement that the earth was fighting back, that the red stone exacted a price in blood for every ounce of color it yielded, yet the empire did not stop. It simply fed more bodies into the mouth of the mine, treating human life as a renewable resource in the pursuit of the eternal red. When Rome fell, the knowledge of Mercury did not disappear. It merely changed hands, flowing into the alembics and crucibles of the Islamic Golden Age, and eventually the stone towers of medieval Europe, where it ceased to be a mere pigment and became the central obsession of the alchemical mind. To the alchemist, Mercury was not just a metal, it was the prima materia, the chaotic, fluid first matter from which all other metals were born. Scholars like Jābir ibn Hayyān proposed that all metals were essentially mixtures of mercury and sulfur in varying purities and proportions. Gold was simply mercury that had been perfectly cured and balanced by nature, while lead was mercury that had fallen ill and become corrupt. This theory sparked a feverish, thousand-year quest to heal the base metals, to scour the lead with fire and chemical agents until it returned to its golden state. In damp cellars and high turrets, men spent their fortunes and their sanities chasing the philosopher's mercury, a theoretical substance that was not the wet, physical quicksilver, but a spiritual essence hidden inside it. They boiled mercury for months, sealed in glass vessels known as hermetic seals, watching the vapors rise and fall, breathing in the sweet, metallic air of the laboratory, unaware that the very substance they believed would grant them godhood was slowly erasing their minds, replacing their logic with the erratic, trembling paranoia that became the stereotype of the mad wizard. This mystical reverence for Mercury collided violently with the biological reality of the late 15th century, when a new and terrifying shadow fell across Europe, the Great Pox, or Syphilis. It appeared suddenly, likely carried back from the New World by the sailors of Columbus, a bacterial scourge that rotted the flesh, collapsed the bridge of the nose, and drove its victims to madness before killing them. Europe was defenseless. Prayers failed, herbs failed, and the medical establishment stood paralyzed before a plague that turned the act of love into a sentence of decay. In their desperation, physicians turned to the heavy guns of the alchemical arsenal, dragging mercury out of the laboratory and into the sick room. The logic was brutal and rudimentary. Mercury was a poison, yes, but perhaps it was poisonous enough to kill the disease before it killed the patient. Thus began the era of the mercurial cure, a medical horror story encapsulated by the grim aphorism of the time. One night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. The treatment was a torture that masqueraded as medicine, a regime of chemical violence that makes modern chemotherapy look gentle by comparison. Patients were slathered in ointments made of mercury and animal grease, rubbed into open sores and absorbed through the skin, or they were placed in fumigation cabinets, wooden boxes where they sat naked while mercury was thrown onto hot coals beneath them, cooking them in a thick, toxic vapor. The physicians believed that the foul fluids dripping from the patient's body were the disease leaving the system, but in reality, they were witnessing acute heavy metal poisoning. The patients would salivate uncontrollably, producing pints of metallic-tasting spit a day. Their gums would swell and turn black, their teeth would loosen and fall out, and their bones would ache with a deep, penetrating cold. It was a race between the syphilis spirochete and the mercury toxicity to see which would claim the life first. For centuries, this was the accepted standard of care, a grim testament to humanity's willingness to endure absolute agony in the hope of a cure, trusting in the silver metal to burn away the sin of the flesh even as it corroded the machinery of the body. Out of this crucible of suffering emerged a figure who would change the trajectory of science, a man who straddled the line between alchemist and chemist, Paracelsus. He was a bombastic, revolutionary Swiss physician who burned the books of the ancients and declared that the true purpose of alchemy was not to make gold, but to make medicines. He looked at the toxic chaos of the mercury treatments and saw not a failure of the substance, but a failure of dosage. All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison, he famously declared. Paracelsus refined mercury, combining it with chlorine to create calomel, a white powder that was less immediately violent than the raw metal, but still insidiously toxic. He legitimized the internal use of mercury, turning it into a standard pill for everything from constipation to depression, effectively embedding a heavy metal neurotoxin into the daily pharmacopoeia of the Western world. He was the hinge upon which history turned, transforming mercury from a mystical curiosity into a standardized industrial product, paving the way for a world where the poison was measured, packaged, and sold with the stamp of scientific authority. As the scientific revolution gained momentum, mercury's unique physical properties, its density, its uniform expansion with heat, and its liquid state, made it indispensable to the new instruments of measurement that were defining the physical world. In 1643, Evangelista Torricelli, a student of Galileo, inverted a glass tube filled with mercury into a dish, creating the first barometer. He discovered that the atmosphere had weight and that the heavy silver column rose and fell with the invisible pressure of the air. Suddenly, mercury was the interpreter of the weather, the judge of the vacuum, the standard by which the world was measured. Soon after, Gabriel Fahrenheit imprisoned the liquid metal in a thin glass capillary, creating the thermometer that would standardize temperature for centuries. Science had tamed the dragon, sealing the toxic ghost inside glass cages where it could be observed but not touched, creating a false sense of safety. We invited it into our homes, hanging it on our walls to tell us if we needed a coat, placing it under our tongues to check for fever, forgetting that the thin glass was the only thing separating us from a vapor that could shatter the mind. Yet even as science tried to contain it, the allure of mercury's beauty led to one of its most widespread and intimate applications, the mirror. For centuries, mirrors were polished metal discs, dim and distorting, but the Venetians on the island of Murano perfected a technique of layering a tin mercury amalgam onto the back of a glass pane. The result was a reflection of startling clarity, a perfect, liquid capture of the self. Europe went mad for these mirrors. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles was built as a temple to this technology, a corridor of frozen light that reflected the glory of the Sun King. But the cost of this vanity was hidden in the workshops of Murano and later France, where the mirror makers smoothed the mercury paste onto the glass by hand. These artisans were notoriously short-lived, suffering from mirror makers' trembling, a neurological disintegration that began with a shake in the hand and ended with psychosis. The aristocracy admired their own beautiful reflections in the glass, unaware that the image was made possible by the sacrifice of the minds of the men who crafted it. We were looking at ourselves through a film of poison, a perfect metaphor for the era. A surface of dazzling brilliance concealing a foundation of toxicity. By the turn of the 19th century, the relationship between humanity and mercury had shifted from the mystical to the deeply utilitarian, moving out of the alchemists' shadowed tower and into the clamorous, steam-filled factories of the Industrial Revolution. It was here, in the cramped workshops of London, Paris, and Connecticut, that the metal found a new and tragic vocation, the manufacture of the gentleman's hat. Fashion, with its ruthless demand for perfection, dictated that the finest hats be made of felt, a textile produced by matting together fur fibers until they formed a smooth, waterproof fabric. But the fur of rabbits and beavers did not mat easily. The fibers were too straight, too slick. To force them to lock together, hatters turned to a chemical solution known as secretage, a bath of mercury nitrate that turned the fur a sickly orange, a process called carotting. In the steaming, unventilated backrooms of the hatting trade, men spent their days bent over vats of this boiling toxic soup, inhaling the vapors as they steamed and pressed the felt into shape. The mercury broke down the keratin in the fur, unraveling the proteins just enough to make them bind, but it was simultaneously unraveling the proteins in the hatter's brains, chemically severing the neural pathways that governed motor control and emotional stability. This gave rise to a medical phenomenon so widespread it became a colloquialism before it became a diagnosis: the Mad Hatter. This was not the whimsical eccentricity of storybooks, but a grim, physiological disintegration known as erethism. The symptoms were specific and terrifying. It began with the Danbury Shakes, named after the hat-making town in Connecticut, where workers would develop tremors so violent they could not lift a cup of coffee to their lips without spilling it. But the physical tremors were merely the prelude to the psychological collapse. Hatters became pathologically shy, terrified of being watched, prone to explosive outbursts of rage followed by profound, weeping depressions. Their personalities were eroded by the vapor, replaced by a paranoid, timid husk of a self. The industry knew the cause. The masters of the trade saw the connection between the orange solution and the shaking men, but the demand for the perfect, stiff-brimmed hat was an economic engine that could not be slowed by the mere madness of the workforce. For decades, the well-dressed men of the Victorian era walked the streets wearing crowns of felt that had been stiffened by the sacrifice of sanity, carrying a trace of the poison on their heads as a silent marker of the invisible cost of industrial style. But while the hatters were slowly poisoning themselves in the cities, a geological event on the other side of the world was about to unleash Mercury on a scale that would permanently alter the biosphere of the planet. In 1848, gold was discovered in the streams of California, triggering the largest mass migration in human history. The gold rush is often romanticized as a story of pans and pickaxes, of rugged individualism and luck, but in reality, it was a massive chemical engineering project driven by Mercury. The gold in the Sierra Nevada was not all sitting in convenient nuggets. Much of it was flour gold, fine dust, scattered through millions of tons of gravel and sediment. To capture it, mechanical force was insufficient. The miners needed a chemical magnet, something that could sift through the chaos of the riverbed and grab only the gold. Mercury was the key. When liquid mercury is introduced to gold-bearing gravel, it does not merely mix, it hunts. It chemically wets the gold, swallowing the dust into an amalgam, a heavy gray putty that sinks to the bottom of the sluice box while the lighter sand washes away. To recover the gold, the miners simply heated the amalgam, boiling the mercury off into the pristine mountain air, leaving the sponge of pure gold behind. This process, known as amalgamation, turned the American West into a vast open-air laboratory for heavy metal contamination. The demand for Quicksilver exploded overnight, and by a twist of geological irony, California possessed its own supply of the red blood ore. Just south of San Francisco lay the New Almaden mine, named after its Spanish ancestor, a deposit of cinnabar so rich that the Olon people had used it for thousands of years as body paint. Now, it was industrialized. The mine became a hellscape of vertical shafts and roasting furnaces, pumping out millions of pounds of liquid mercury to feed the hunger of the gold fields. The scale of the loss was staggering. It is estimated that for every pound of gold recovered, a pound of mercury was lost to the environment, spilled from sluice boxes, washed out of riffles, or boiled off as vapor to condense on the pine trees and soil of the mountains. The rivers of California, once clear and teeming with salmon, were transformed into toxic conveyor belts, carrying tons of mercury downstream toward the San Francisco Bay, embedding a legacy of poison into the sediment that would linger for centuries. This was the balloon effect of the industrial age. Squeezing the earth for one resource inevitably caused a blowout of toxicity elsewhere. The gold that built the banks of San Francisco and funded the expansion of the American empire was washed in a bath of neurotoxin. The miners, focused entirely on the yellow metal, ignored the silver sickness that crept into their camps. They suffered from loosening teeth, excessive salivation, and the miner's sickness that was often misdiagnosed as malaria or exhaustion. The landscape itself began to change. The hydraulic mining cannons, which blasted away entire mountainsides to get at the gold, washed unimaginable quantities of mercury-laden silt into the valleys, choking the farmlands below and raising riverbeds until they flooded entire towns. It was a war against the earth, fought with water and poison, and the earth absorbed the blow, storing the mercury in the deep mud of the river bottoms, a ticking chemical time bomb waiting for the future. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, the industrial applications of mercury metastasized. It was no longer just for gold and hats, it was becoming the blood of the new electrical age. Mercury conducts electricity, and because it is a liquid, it can serve as a seamless, non-wearing switch. It found its way into the silent, tilting switches of thermostats, the rectifiers that converted AC power to DC for the new subway systems, and the streetlights that bathed the growing cities in a spectral blue-green glow. The element was everywhere, flowing through the veins of the modern infrastructure, hidden behind walls and inside machines. It was in the batteries, the pesticides sprayed on the crops, and the paints used to coat the hulls of ships. The scientific community, drunk on the utility of the metal, largely ignored the mounting evidence of its danger. It was seen as a manageable risk, a substance that could be controlled with protocols and ventilation. But mercury is an element that defies control. It is volatile, persistent, and bioaccumulative. It does not disappear, it cycles. The vapor released by a gold miner in 1850 did not vanish. It rose into the atmosphere, drifted on the global winds, and rained down into the oceans, beginning a slow, invisible journey up the food chain that would eventually circle back to the very species that dug it up. The hinge of history began to creak ominously in the early 20th century as chemistry advanced. We began to synthesize new forms of mercury, organic compounds like methyl mercury, that were far more deadly than the elemental metal. These were designed as fungicides to protect grain seeds from rot, a miracle for agriculture that promised to end famine. The seeds were coated in a bright pink mercury compound, a warning color that was meant to say, "Do not eat." But hunger is a powerful force, and warnings are easily ignored or misunderstood. In rural communities across the globe, from Iraq to Pakistan to Guatemala, the pink grain intended for planting would occasionally be ground into flour and baked into bread during times of shortage. The result was mass poisoning events of biblical proportions, where entire villages would succumb to blindness, paresthesia, and death. These were the first tremors of the modern crisis, the warning shots that the marriage between organic chemistry and heavy metals had created a monster that could slip through biological defenses with terrifying ease. We had taken the silver ghost and given it a new, lethal body, one that the human organism mistook for a nutrient, absorbing it into the brain with efficient, suicidal speed. The mid-20th century dawned not with the light of the sun, but with the neon glow of the synthetic age, a plastic revolution that promised to wrap the world in convenience, durability, and sterility. Following the devastation of the Second World War, the global economy was hungry for the materials of the future: PVC, vinyl, acetates, the building blocks of a modern consumer paradise. To create these miracles of hydrocarbon engineering, the chemical industry needed a catalyst, a spark to drive the reactions that turned oil into plastic. Once again, they turned to the heavy liquid silver. Mercury was the essential worker in the production of acetaldehyde, a primary precursor for plastics, used in massive industrial reactors where it facilitated the chemical bonding of carbon chains. It was a role played in the shadows, hidden deep within the labyrinth of pipes and pressure vessels of the burgeoning chemical plants. A silent partner in the creation of the record albums, raincoats, and toys that defined the post-war boom. But unlike the gold rush, where the mercury was lost to the open air, these factories believed they were contained systems, dumping their spent wastewater into the nearby bays and rivers, operating under the fatal assumption that the vastness of the ocean was an infinite diluter, a graveyard where industrial sins would simply dissolve into nothingness. They were wrong. In the dark, oxygen-starved mud of the ocean floor, a biological alchemy was taking place that no chemist in a white coat had predicted. The heavy, inorganic mercury waste, largely thought to be inert, was settling into the sediment, where it met the ancient, invisible workforce of the deep. Anaerobic bacteria, these microorganisms, thriving in the muck, performed a terrifying transmutation. They took the inorganic mercury atoms and methylated them, bonding them to carbon and hydrogen to create methyl mercury. This was not merely a change in structure, it was a change in nature. Inorganic mercury is difficult for the body to absorb, it is largely excreted. But methyl mercury is an organic mimic, a molecular Trojan horse that the living cell mistakes for an essential amino acid called methionine. It is lipophilic, meaning it dissolves in fat, allowing it to slip effortlessly through the cell membranes of plankton, then into the krill, then into the sardines, and finally into the tuna. With every step up the food chain, the concentration intensified, a process known as biomagnification. By the time it reached the apex predator, the poison was millions of times more concentrated than it was in the water, a pure, distilled neurotoxin packaged in the living flesh of the sea. The epicenter of this silent apocalypse was a small, picturesque inlet on the southern island of Kyushu, Japan, known as Minamata Bay. They washed their vegetables in it, their children swam in it, and they ate its harvest with gratitude, unaware that the company they treated with such deference was slowly turning their pantry into a morgue. The first warnings did not come from the people, but from the animals, the sensitive biological instruments that register a disturbance in the force of nature long before human perception catches up. In the early 1950s, the bay began to exhibit a bizarre, surreal horror. Fish would be seen swimming erratically near the surface, flashing their bellies to the sun, easily plucked from the water by hand. Crows would fall from the sky mid-flight, crashing into the earth with broken necks. But the most terrifying omen was the cats. The village cats, usually agile and aloof, began to display a grotesque choreography of madness. They would drool excessively, walk with a staggering, drunken gait, and then suddenly explode into violent convulsions, leaping into the air, running in circles, and often dashing headlong into the sea to drown. The locals called it the dancing cat fever, a dark folk name for a phenomenon they could not understand. It was a scene from a Gothic nightmare, a quiet fishing village watching its feline guardians commit mass suicide, the sea swallowing them up one by one, a grim premonition that the biological order was breaking down at the neural level. Then the shadow fell upon the children. In 1956, a 5-year-old girl was brought to the local hospital with symptoms that baffled the doctors. She could not speak clearly, her words were slurred and broken. She could not walk. Her legs buckled as if the signals from her brain were being scrambled. Her hands shook violently, unable to hold chopsticks or button a shirt. Within weeks, her sister developed the same condition, then the neighbor's daughter. It spread through the fishing hamlets like a curse, a strange disease that defied classification. It looked like meningitis, but there was no fever. It looked like syphilis, but the patients were children and grandmothers. It was a neurological disintegration of the most cruel variety. The victims would shout uncontrollably, their bodies contorting into rigid arcs, their vision narrowing until they looked at the world through tunneled darkness. They lost the sense of touch, unable to feel the ground beneath their feet or the object in their hand, drifting in a sensory void while their motor cortex fired random, explosive commands to their muscles. The doctors coined a name for it. Kibio, the mystery illness, a label that carried with it the terrifying weight of the unknown. The investigation that followed was a noir detective story played out in the wards of a rural hospital and the boardrooms of a powerful corporation. Dr. Hajime Hosokawa, the director of the Kiso Factory Hospital, began to map the cases, realizing they were clustered entirely in the fishing villages. He performed experiments on cats, feeding them food mixed with the factory wastewater, and watched in horror as they began to dance the dance of death. He knew with chilling certainty that the factory was the killer. The poison was in the fish, and the fish were eating the waste. But Kiso was not merely a factory, it was the state, the power, the law. When faced with the evidence, The corporation did not stop, they doubled down. They suppressed the reports, intimidated the victims, and in a final act of industrial sociopathy, they rerouted the wastewater discharge from the bay to the mouth of the Minamata River, hoping to disperse the poison further out to sea. Instead, they simply spread the contamination to a wider population, infecting thousands more in a deliberate calculation that profits were worth the price of human collateral. This was the moment the mask fell from the face of the industrial age. The Minamata disease was not a disease at all. It was a mass poisoning, a chemical assault on a civilian population. The mercury, now in its potent organic form, was eating holes in the brains of the victims, specifically targeting the cerebellum and the sensory cortex. It dissolved the neurons that allowed a human being to exist in the world, to walk, to talk, to feel, to think. Inside the womb, the tragedy was even more profound. Pregnant women who showed mild or no symptoms gave birth to babies with severe congenital defects, born with brains that had been ravaged in utero. The placenta, usually a barrier against toxins, actively pumped the methyl mercury into the fetus, acting like a sponge for the mother's poison. These fetal minamata babies were born into a world of silence and pain, their limbs twisted, their minds trapped in bodies that would never obey them, living testaments to the fact that the mercury cycle had closed the loop, moving from the factory pipe to the mother's blood to the unborn child, stealing the future before it had even drawn its first breath. The fires of Minamata eventually burned down to embers of litigation and bureaucratic remorse, but the smoke they generated did not clear. It merely dispersed, thinning out to become a global, invisible veil that now drapes across the entire planet. We have entered the era of the background hum, where the violence of mercury is no longer localized to a single bay or a specific factory, but is diffused into the very atmosphere we breathe. Today, the primary engine of mercury pollution is not the manufacture of hats or the amalgamation of silver, but the burning of coal. Every lump of coal contains a trace amount of ancient mercury, locked away in the carboniferous forests of the deep past. When we burn it to power our cities and servers, we liberate that ghost, sending tons of mercury vapor into the stratosphere every year. It rides the jet stream, a molecular passenger on the global winds, drifting from the smokestacks of developing nations to the pristine ice fields of the poles. This is the grasshopper effect, a thermal mechanism where toxins jump from warm climates to cold ones, condensing and falling with the snow, turning the Arctic, a place with no industry, into a chemical sink. In the frozen north, far from the furnaces of industry, this atmospheric fallout creates a tragedy of bioaccumulation that rivals the horror of Japan. The mercury settles on the lichen, which is eaten by the caribou. It falls into the water, where it is absorbed by the plankton. It travels up the food chain with ruthless efficiency, concentrating in the fat of seals, walruses, and whales, the traditional diet of the Inuit and other indigenous peoples of the circumpolar north. These communities, living in what should be the cleanest environment on Earth, now carry some of the highest body burdens of mercury in the human population. Mothers in Greenland, who have never seen a coal plant, breastfeed their infants with milk that technically qualifies as hazardous waste. The neurotoxin is stealing the cognitive potential of the next generation, shaving IQ points off children, subtly eroding their ability to focus, to learn, to connect. It is a silent, cultural genocide driven by the energy demands of distant strangers, a theft of the mind that leaves no bruises and breaks no bones, but slowly dims the light of human potential in the most remote corners of the world. While the sky rains down the legacy of the industrial age, a more visceral and primitive form of poisoning is exploding in the equatorial jungles of the Amazon, Indonesia, and Africa. This is the resurgence of artisanal and small-scale gold mining, ASGM, a desperate, poverty-driven gold rush that mirrors the chaos of 1849, but with deadlier consequences. Millions of impoverished miners, often working outside the law, use mercury to extract gold from river silt, just as the Romans did. They mix the liquid metal with mud in plastic buckets, using their bare hands, and then burn the amalgam with kitchen blowtorches in open-air shacks. The jungle absorbs the vapor, the rivers swallow the runoff, and the miners inhale the fumes directly. It is a scene of medieval alchemy played out with modern desperation. In the Amazon basin, the trees are standing in pools of metallic sludge, and the indigenous tribes downriver are suffering from tremors and vision loss, their rivers turned into lifeless, silvery graveyards. This sector is now the largest source of mercury pollution on Earth, a chaotic, decentralized catastrophe driven by the global price of gold, a direct link between the wedding ring on a finger in New York and a poisoned river in Peru. But for the average citizen of the developed world, the threat does not come from a mine or a smokestack, it comes from the plate. We have developed a taste for the apex predators of the sea, the tuna, the swordfish, the shark. These magnificent hunters are the ultimate reservoirs of the ocean's toxicity. They swim for years, eating smaller fish that have eaten smaller fish, aggregating the mercury of millions of meals into their muscle tissue. When we sit down at a sushi bar or a high-end seafood restaurant, we are participating in a game of toxic roulette. A single steak of swordfish can contain a dose of methylmercury that exceeds the safe weekly limit for a human being. We have normalized this risk, treating it as a dietary footnote, a use with caution label on a luxury product. Pregnant women are told to avoid certain fish, a tacit admission that our food supply is compromised, yet the appetite for bluefin and ahi continues to drive the market, pulling the poison out of the deep ocean and placing it directly onto the porcelain of the dinner table. We are eating the ghosts of our own industrial history, consuming the waste we dumped decades ago, now returned to us in the flesh of the creatures we prize most. The insidiousness of modern mercury exposure lies in its subtlety. We rarely see the dancing cats or the twisted limbs of Minamata anymore. Instead, we see a statistical erosion of health. It is the child with a learning disability that cannot quite be explained, the adult with a tremor that is dismissed as aging, the increase in cardiovascular disease linked to heavy metal presence in the blood. It is a subclinical pandemic, a lowering of the global baseline of health that is difficult to pin on a single cause, but impossible to separate from the environmental load. Science has tried to intervene. In 2013, the world signed the Minamata Convention on Mercury, a global treaty designed to phase out the metal from commercial products and industrial processes. It was a landmark moment, a declaration that the Quicksilver era must end. We began to ban mercury thermometers, blood pressure cuffs, and button batteries. We started to pull the silver fillings, dental amalgams that are 50% mercury, out of our mouths, replacing them with resin, acknowledging that we had been walking around with toxic waste dumps drilled into our teeth for a century. However, the problem with mercury is that it is an element. It cannot be destroyed. You cannot burn it, break it down, or wish it away. It is immortal. Every ounce of mercury ever dug out of olmedane or hydrogen still exists somewhere on this planet. When we ban it, we must store it. This has created a new, bizarre infrastructure, the Mercury Repository. We are now building massive, high-security warehouses, often in salt mines or bedrock bunkers, to store thousands of tons of liquid mercury in steel flasks. These are the tombs of the living metal, designed to hold the substance for eternity, or at least until civilization collapses. We are returning the genie to the bottle, burying it back in the dark earth from which we stole it, hoping that the steel will not rust, that the seals will not fail, and that the future will remember where the poison is buried. It is a grim custodial duty, a permanent mortgage on the planet that we have left to our descendants, the guardianship of a lake of silver fire that must never again see the light of day. In our attempt to pivot to a green future, we even stumbled back into the arms of the old lover. The compact fluorescent light bulb, CFL, hailed as the savior of energy efficiency in the early 2000s, was a glass spiral filled with mercury vapor. To save the climate from carbon, we mandated a bulb that, if broken, required a hazmat cleanup protocol in the living room. It was a classic example of the mercury paradox. Its utility is so high, its efficiency so perfect, that we constantly rationalize its risk. Only now, with the advent of LED technology, are we finally, truly moving away from the vapor-filled glass. But millions of those bulbs are currently sitting in landfills, crushed under the weight of trash, leaking their silver breath into the groundwater. A reminder that every technological solution carries a chemical shadow, and that the legacy of Mercury is not a chapter we have closed, but a story we are still writing in the margins of our soil, our water, and our blood. To understand the full gravity of our relationship with Mercury, we must ultimately accept the terrifying permanence of the element itself. Civilizations rise and fall, empires crumble into dust, and the languages we speak fade into silence, but Mercury remains. It is an elemental fact of the universe, a substance that cannot be unmade by any force within human grasp. The atom of mercury that drove a Roman slave to madness in the pits of Almudene is the same atom that swirled in the hatmaker's vat in Victorian London, and it is the same atom that now rests in the muscle tissue of a bluefin tuna swimming in the Pacific. We have not created this poison, nor can we destroy it. We have merely acted as its frantic couriers, digging it from the safe, cold sleep of the Earth's crust and scattering it into the wind and water. We mobilized the immobile, waking the dragon from its geological slumber, and now we must live inside the cage with it forever. The Earth is a closed system, a spherical vessel in the vacuum of space. There is no away where we can throw our waste. Every gram of quicksilver we have ever excavated is still here, cycling endlessly between the air, the soil, the ocean, and the flesh, a silver ghost haunting the biosphere it was never meant to inhabit. In this light, the history of Mercury is not just a story of industrial errors or medical mishaps. It is a profound reflection of the human condition, a mirror made of liquid metal that shows us our own fatal flaws. We were seduced by its beauty, mesmerized by its impossible state, a metal that flows like water, a stone that bleeds like a man. We projected our deepest desires onto it. The desire for immortality, for wealth, for beauty, and for control over the natural world. The alchemists believed it contained the spirit of the world. The emperors believed it was the elixir of life. The industrialists believed it was the ultimate tool of extraction. In every era, we looked into the silver pool and saw what we wanted to see, ignoring the toxicity that radiated from it. It tricked us. It played upon our vanity and our greed, promising us the transmutation of base matter into gold, while quietly transmuting our own neural pathways into dust. It is the ultimate trickster of the periodic table, a substance that gives with one hand while taking the mind with the other, leaving us with a legacy of gold bars and broken brains. Now, as we stand in the twilight of the industrial age, looking back at the wreckage, we have entered the phase of stewardship, a grim custodial era where we must guard the tombs of the element we unleashed. Deep beneath the earth, in the dry, stable geology of salt mines in Germany and bedrock caverns in the United States, we are stacking the steel flasks. These are the final resting places of the mercury retired from the chlorine plants, the thermometers, and the stockpiles of the Cold War. It is a reversal of the mining process. Instead of bringing the ore up, we are carrying the metal down, returning it to the dark from which it came. There is a solemnity to these repositories, a temple-like stillness where the living metal is finally put to rest, sealed behind blast doors and monitored by sensors. We are burying our sins, hoping that the geology will hold, that the steel will not corrode, and that the future generations will understand the warnings we leave behind. We are building the pyramids of the Anthropocene not to honor kings, but to imprison a monster, leaving a toxic inheritance that will outlast our concrete, our data, and perhaps our species. Yet, even as we bury the industrial stockpiles, the atmospheric cycle continues, a planetary heartbeat of vaporization and deposition that we can no longer control. The mercury is in the jet stream, in the Arctic ice, in the deep ocean currents. It has become a part of the background radiation of existence, a faint, metallic taste in the mouth of the world. We have altered the chemistry of the planet at a fundamental level, raising the baseline of toxicity for every living thing. The neurological clarity of the pre-industrial world is gone, replaced by a subtle, pervasive interference. We must ask ourselves what we have lost in this exchange. What brilliance was dimmed in the minds of the hatters? What songs were unwritten by the poisoned musicians? What futures were erased in the womb of the Minamata mothers? The cost of mercury is not measured in dollars or tons, but in the silence of the synaptic gap, in the tremors of the hand, in the fog that descends upon the mind. We traded the integrity of our own nervous systems for gold and vinyl, a transaction that can never be reversed, only mourned. There is a strange, poetic justice in the fact that the metal we used to build the mirrors that reflected our vanity is the same metal that now forces us to look at the consequences of our actions. Mercury is the great revelator. It reveals the interconnectedness of all things, how the burning of a rock in one continent can poison a child in another, how the gold ring on a finger is connected to the destruction of a rainforest, how the industrial past bleeds into the biological present. It has taught us that the earth is smaller than we thought, that the barriers between the mind and the body are porous, and that the things we dig up do not belong to us. They belong to the deep time of the planet, and they will always return to it. We are transient guests on a rock that is largely composed of poisons, surviving only by the grace of the geological locks that keep them safely sequestered. When we pick the lock, we do not liberate the treasure. We liberate the jailer. In the end, we return to the Cinnabar. Deep in the quiet veins of the earth, the red stone still waits, untouched by the pickaxe or the drill. It sits in the crushing dark, heavy and cold, a crystal of potential energy that has existed since the cooling of the crust. It is beautiful in its isolation, a vibrant streak of blood in the gray limestone, dreaming its metallic dreams. It does not hate us, it does not want to hurt us, it simply is. It is the primitive, chaotic heart of the world, waiting for the next curious hand to reach out and touch it. But perhaps, after thousands of years of madness and death, we have finally learned the lesson of the silver ghost. We have learned to leave the stone in the wall, to let the sleeping dragon lie, to admire the beauty of the red rock without demanding that it bleed for us. The mercury will outwait us, shining in the dark, eternal and patient, the silent witness to the brief, feverish experiment of human civilization. We drift away into the history books, but the silver remains, a perfect, unblemished mirror, reflecting the emptiness of the void and the enduring, toxic beauty of the stars. To truly understand the seductive power of the silver poison, we must step away from the industrial roar of the modern age and return to the candlelit chambers of the 17th century, where the intellect of Europe was being sharpened on the whetstone of Mercury. It is here, in the private diaries and secret laboratories of the Enlightenment's greatest minds, that we find the most chilling evidence of the metal's ability to dismantle genius from the inside out. We often think of mercury poisoning as a disease of the poor, the miner, the hatter, the factory worker, but its most illustrious victims were the kings and the philosophers who sought to master it. They invited the ghost into their blood voluntarily, driven by a thirst for knowledge and power that blinded them to the tremors in their own hands. The story of King Charles II of England is not merely a tale of monarchy. It is a clinical case study of a man slowly hollowed out by his own hobby. Charles was a monarch of the Restoration, a man of science who built a private laboratory in Whitehall Palace, a subterranean room where he spent hours distilling mercury, fascinated by its ability to fix volatile spirits and extract the essence of metals. The king's laboratory was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the pressures of the court and commune with the elemental forces of the universe. He called it the king's laboratory, but in retrospect, it was a suicide chamber. He worked with spirit of salt and mercury, heating them in unventilated spaces, inhaling the invisible vapor that rose from the crucibles. His courtiers noted that the king often appeared pale, that he suffered from bouts of inexplicable irritability and profound fatigue. They attributed it to the weight of the crown, but the biology tells a different story. In his final days, Charles suffered a seizure while shaving, a classic symptom of neurotoxicity. The physicians, in their ignorance, treated him with the standard protocols of the time, which included bleeding him and, tragically, administering more mercury. The autopsy described his brain as being full of fluid, a crude description that aligns with the cerebral edema caused by acute heavy metal poisoning. The King of England had not just died, he had been alchemically transmuted into a corpse by the very substance he sought to rule. But if Charles II was a hobbyist, Sir Isaac Newton was a devotee. The man who defined the laws of gravity and motion, the architect of the rational universe, was also a secret alchemist who spent more time boiling mercury than he did watching apples fall. Newton left behind millions of words of alchemical notes, vast, rambling manuscripts where he documented his obsession with the net, a code name for an alloy of iron and copper refined with antimony and mercury. He believed this substance was a key to the philosopher's stone. In 1693, the mind that had unraveled the rainbow suddenly snapped. Newton suffered a nervous breakdown of catastrophic proportions. He wrote letters to his friends, John Locke and Samuel Pepys, that were filled with paranoid delusions and erratic accusations. He accused Locke of trying to embroil him with women and claimed that people were plotting against him. For a year, the greatest genius of the age was reduced to a trembling, paranoid wreck, unable to sleep, his mind consumed by a distemper that defied explanation. For centuries, historians attributed Newton's breakdown to the stress of his work or a repressed psychological crisis. But in the 1970s, a team of researchers performed a forensic analysis on a lock of Newton's hair that had been preserved in a private collection. The results were a chemical smoking gun. The hair contained mercury levels nearly 40 times the natural average, along with high concentrations of lead and arsenic. Newton had not just been stressed, he had been poisoned. The distemper was the classic erethism of mercury toxicity, the paranoia, the tremors, the insomnia. It is a terrifying realization. The Principia Mathematica, the foundational text of modern physics, was written by a man whose neurons were being actively bombarded by heavy metal ions. The clarity of his laws of motion stands in stark contrast to the chaos of his internal biology. He survived the crisis, likely because he took a break from his laboratory, allowing his body to slowly purge enough of the toxin to restore his sanity, but the shadow of the silver ghost remained in his cells until the day he died. This pattern of royal poisoning extends far beyond England. It stretches east to the frozen courts of Russia, where Ivan the Terrible reigned with a cruelty that has become legendary. Ivan is remembered as a sadist, a man who beat his own son to death and orchestrated the massacre of Novgorod. But was his madness purely a defect of character, or was it a defect of chemistry? Ivan suffered from a debilitating condition that caused his joints to swell and his bones to ache with an agony that made him howl in the night. To treat this pain, his physicians prescribed the standard remedy of the East: mercury ointments and vapor baths. Forensic examination of Ivan's remains in the 20th century revealed mercury levels that were off the charts, literally thousands of times higher than a fatal dose for a modern human. His bones were reservoirs of Quicksilver. The mercury did not just treat his pain, it fueled his rage. The madness of Ivan the Terrible, the erratic outbursts, the paranoia, our own faces. But in the 16th century, on the foggy, isolated island of Murano in the Venetian lagoon, a guild of glassmakers stumbled upon a secret that would change human consciousness: the mercury amalgam mirror. They discovered that by laying a thin sheet of tin foil on a marble table, flooding it with liquid mercury, and then sliding a plate of glass over the top, the two metals would fuse into a reflective skin of absolute perfection. It was a technological marvel, capturing light with a fidelity that felt supernatural. Suddenly, the human ego had a high-definition witness, but the Venetian Council of Ten, the secretive governing body of the state, understood that this monopoly was worth more than gold. They locked the glassmakers on the island, declaring that any artisan who left Murano to sell the secret would be hunted down and assassinated. It was a prison of crystal and poison, where the price of the perfect reflection was the life of the creator. The process of making these mirrors was a nightmare of toxic exposure. The silvering tables were large, flat stones where pools of mercury sat exposed to the air. The artisan had to lean over the table, his face inches from the fuming metal, to smooth the tin and slide the glass. Day after day, year after year, they inhaled the vapor. The Murano tremors became a grim occupational signature. A young apprentice would enter the guild with steady hands, and within a decade, he would be unable to hold a wine glass. Their gums would bleed, their teeth would loosen, and a distinctive, erratic personality change would set in, a mix of extreme shyness and explosive irritability. They were ghosts in the machine of Venetian luxury, men who spent their lives creating the surfaces upon which the wealthy would admire their beauty, while they themselves slowly disintegrated. The mirror was not just a looking glass, it was a vampire, draining the vitality of the maker to feed the vanity of the buyer. The secret, however, could not be contained. In the 1660s, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the finance minister to Louis XIV of France, orchestrated a campaign of industrial espionage to steal the mercury mirror technology. He bribed Venetian artisans to defect to Paris, smuggling them out under the cover of night to the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The result was the Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. It is one of the most famous rooms in the world, a corridor of 17 massive arched mirrors that reflect the gardens and the sun. When we walk through it today, we see the grandeur of the Sun King, but a toxicologist sees a monument to mass poisoning. During the construction of the mirrors, the mortality rate in the French workshops was horrific. The workers, unaccustomed to the heat and the volume of mercury required for such massive pains, dropped like flies. The vapor concentration in the workshops would have been lethal, creating a hallucinogenic atmosphere of sweat and metallic fumes. The courtiers who preened in that hall, adjusting their wigs and checking their powder, were staring into a surface created by the sacrifice of hundreds of lungs and brains, a literal crystallization of the aristocracy's indifference to the suffering that underpinned their splendor. As the mirror craze subsided into normalcy, the mercury demon found a new home in the fashion of the head. The Mad Hatter is a figure of nursery rhymes, a whimsical, tea-drinking eccentric, but the reality he represents is one of the darkest chapters in labor history. The process of carotting felt, using mercury nitrate to turn animal fur into a malleable fabric, was brought to England by Huguenot refugees in the late 17th century. It became the standard. A hatter's workshop was a sensory hell, a dark, cramped room filled with steam smelling of wet fur and the sharp, acidic tang of the nitrate solution. The hatter stood over a kettle of boiling water, shrinking and shaping the felt, directly inhaling the steam that carried the mercury ions straight into his bloodstream. The hatter's shakes were so common that they were often ignored by doctors as a mere trade quirk, but the psychological toll was profound. In the medical literature of the Victorian era, we find heartbreaking case studies of these men. One report describes a hatter who, upon being asked a simple question by a stranger, would break into uncontrollable weeping. Another describes a man who became so paranoid that he believed his own children were conspiring to kill him. This was erethism in its purest form, a pathological social anxiety combined with emotional lability. The hatters were often ostracized, not just because they were poor, but because they were strange. They were seen as drunks, as lunatics, as broken men. The cruel irony is that the society that rejected them was wearing the cause of their madness on its head. The top hat, the symbol of stability, banking, and respectability, was a reservoir of neurotoxin. When a gentleman tipped his hat to a lady, he was gripping a brim stiffened by poison. When he sweated on a hot day, the mercury in the felt would re-vaporize, giving him a microdose of the very madness that plagued the man who made it. The industry in Danbury, Connecticut, the hat city of the world, offers a granular look at the American experience of this tragedy. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Danbury produced millions of hats a year. The town's economy was built on mercury. The Danbury Shakes were a local condition, accepted with a shrug, but the environmental footprint was even more devastating than the occupational one. The hat factories dumped their waste directly into the still river. For decades, the river ran with high concentrations of mercury nitrate. It is said that the color of the river changed with the color of the hats being dyed that day, but the underlying poison remained constant. Even today, the soil around the old factory sites in Danbury is a hazardous waste zone. The high school was famously built on a site that had to be remediated for heavy metals. The ghosts of the hatters are not just in the history books. They are in the ground, in the sediment, in the very foundations of the town. This era of the reflective curse teaches us about the disconnect between the product and the process. The Victorian gentleman did not see the trembling hands of the hatter when he looked at his purchase. He saw only the smooth, black felt. The French courtier did not see the coughing, dying Venetian when he looked in the mirror. He saw only his own powdered face. Mercury allowed for the creation of smooth, perfect surfaces, the mirror, the felt, the gilding, that concealed the rough, brutal reality of their production. It was the ultimate agent of superficiality, a chemical that allowed civilization to polish its exterior while rotting its interior. We lived in a world of shiny objects, unaware that the shine was a warning, a signal of a toxicity that was slowly accumulating in the bodies of the workers and the water tables of the cities, waiting for the bill to come due. If the industrial poisoning of the hatter and the miner was a crime of indifference, the medical poisoning of the common citizen was a tragedy of trust. By the mid-19th century, Mercury had successfully rebranded itself. It had shed its medieval alchemical baggage and donned the crisp, authoritative coat of modern pharmacology. It was no longer a mystical substance. It was a cholagogue, a medicine believed to stimulate the flow of bile, the fluid that Victorian physicians were obsessed with purging. The medical logic of the time was hydraulic. Sickness was a stagnation of fluids, and health was a state of flow. Mercury, with its violent ability to induce salivation, diarrhea, and sweating, was the ultimate unclogger. It was the standard of care for everything from constipation to tuberculosis, a chemical hammer used to smash any ailment that defied easy diagnosis. And nowhere was this hammer wielded with more historical consequence than in the medicine chest of the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln is remembered as a man of profound, almost mythical melancholy. His depression was a constant companion, a darkness that he called his hypochondriasis. To combat these bouts of black bile, coupled with chronic constipation and headaches, Lincoln was prescribed blue mass. These were small, dark pills, roughly the size of a peppercorn, composed of liquid mercury crushed with licorice root, rosewater, and honey until the metal was extinguished into a fine gray powder. It was a standard remedy, available in every apothecary in America. Lincoln took them religiously for years, popping the heavy little spheres to clear his system. But modern researchers, recreating the recipe from 19th century pharmacopoeias, have discovered that a single blue mass pill contained nearly 9,000 times the amount of mercury deemed safe by today's standards. Lincoln was not just depressed, he was swimming in a toxic soup. Historians have long noted the erratic behavior of Lincoln in the 1850s, his sudden, explosive outbursts of rage, his insomnia, his tremors. These are not merely the traits of a stressed politician, they are the classic symptoms of mercurialism. During the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, eyewitnesses described him as becoming bizarrely agitated, his voice trembling, his movements jerky. The poison was likely fraying the edges of his nervous system, amplifying his natural melancholy into a pathological despair. But the true miracle of Lincoln's story is his self-awareness. Shortly after his inauguration in 1861, as the weight of the fracturing Union fell upon his shoulders, Lincoln made a pivotal decision. He stopped taking the pills. He told a confidant that the blue mass made him cross and affected his mind. In a moment of supreme clarity, he recognized that the cure was worse than the disease. He flushed the mercury from his life, and historical accounts suggest that his temper stabilized, his patience returned, and his legendary steely resolve took hold. It is a chilling counterfactual to consider. Had Lincoln continued to poison himself with blue mass, the erratic, paranoid decision-making of a mercury-addled brain might have lost the Civil War. The fate of the nation hung on the president's decision to stop swallowing the silver poison. But while Lincoln escaped the trap, millions of others did not. The most heartbreaking chapter in the medical history of mercury unfolded not in the halls of power, but in the nurseries of the early 20th century. This is the story of pink disease, or acrodynia, a scourge that descended upon the children of the Western world with terrifying randomness. It began insidiously. A healthy baby or toddler would suddenly become miserable, crying inconsolably for hours, refusing to eat, and unable to sleep. Then the physical transformation would begin. The child's hands and feet would turn a bright, raw pink, as if they had been dipped in boiling water. The skin would become puffy and cold to the touch, and then it would start to peel away in layers. The pain was excruciating. Children would rub their hands together constantly, trying to soothe the burning itch, sometimes tearing their own skin off in the process. They would shy away from the light, burying their faces in pillows, photophobia, and in severe cases, their teeth would loosen and fall out. For decades, doctors were baffled. Was it a virus, a nutritional deficiency, an allergy? They called it erythritema or Swift's disease, but they had no cure. The mortality rate was significant, mostly from secondary infections, but the morbidity, the suffering, was universal. What the doctors missed, and what the parents could not bear to believe, was that they were the ones poisoning their children. The culprit was teething powder. Brands like Steedman's and Moffat's were household staples, sold in every pharmacy as a gentle way to soothe a fussing baby. The active ingredient was calomel mercurous chloride. It was tasteless, odorless, and white, hiding its metallic nature perfectly. Parents would rub the white powder into the inflamed gums of their teething infants, or mix it into their milk, believing they were administering a harmless sedative. Instead, they were rubbing a neurotoxin directly into the bloodstream of the most vulnerable beings on Earth. The tragedy of pink disease lies in the delay of its discovery. It wasn't until the late 1940s that a pediatrician named Joseph Walkeny began to notice the correlation. He found high levels of mercury in the urine of affected children, but the medical establishment was resistant. Calomel had been used for centuries. It was the gentle mercury, the friend of the nursery. How could it be a killer? It took a campaign of undeniable statistical evidence to finally break the denial. When the teething powders were finally removed from the shelves in the 1950s, pink disease vanished almost overnight. It was a medical miracle that proved the crime. The disease was entirely man-made, a chemically induced hell that we had inflicted on our own offspring in the name of comfort. The generation of pink children grew up, but many carried the invisible scars of early heavy metal exposure, subtle neurological deficits, tremors, or kidney issues, living reminders of an era when the medicine cabinet was a loaded gun. This era of medical mercury reveals the terrifying power of authority. The doctor was a figure of absolute trust, and the prescription was a holy writ. If the doctor said mercury was good, it was good. We suspended our survival instincts in favor of professional opinion. We ignored the body's rejection of the poison, the vomiting, the metallic taste, the pain, interpreting them instead as signs that the medicine was working, that it was cleansing the system. It is a psychological phenomenon as much as a toxicological one, the therapeutic fallacy, where the ritual of treatment blinds us to the harm of the agent. Even today, this legacy lingers in the controversial history of thymrosal, a mercury-based preservative used in vaccines for decades. While the scientific consensus is that the low doses of ethyl mercury in thymrosal were not responsible for the autism epidemic, the public trauma of the mercury story runs deep. The fear is rooted in a valid historical memory. We did poison our children with mercury, we did paint their throats with it, we did rub it on their gums. The cultural scar of pink disease and blue mass has created a permanent skepticism, a deep-seated anxiety about the intersection of heavy metals and healthcare. We have learned through a century of pain that the line between a medicine and a poison is often nothing more than a decimal point in a dosage, or a gap in our knowledge that is only filled after the bodies have been counted. In the winter of 1971, a tragedy of biblical proportions unfolded on the plains of Mesopotamia, not caused by war or drought, but by a catastrophic failure of communication in the global supply chain. This is the story of the Iraq grain disaster, an event that stands as the single largest mass mercury poisoning in history, a grim testament to what happens when the logic of industrial chemistry collides with the desperation of human hunger. It began with a gesture of aid. Iraq was facing a severe drought, and the harvest had failed. To save the country's agriculture, the government ordered 100,000 tons of seed wheat from suppliers in the United States and Mexico. This was high-yield Mexipac wheat, a miracle of the Green Revolution, designed to resist pests and grow in arid soil. But because the grain had to travel across the ocean, it was treated with a powerful fungicide to prevent rot during the voyage. The fungicide was methylmercury. The wheat arrived in the port of Basra late in the season, long after the planting window had closed for many farmers. It came in sacks marked with warning labels in Spanish and English, languages that the rural farmers of Iraq did not speak. The sacks bore the image of a skull and crossbones, but in local culture, the skull was not necessarily a symbol of poison. Sometimes it was merely a symbol of danger or even a pirate brand. But the most fatal design flaw was the color. The grain had been dyed a brilliant, unnatural pink with a mercury-based coating. To the farmers, who were starving and whose families were living on the brink of famine, the pink color looked like a dye that could be washed away. They took the grain down to the rivers and scrubbed it. The pink color disappeared, washing downstream in a cloud of red, leading them to believe the poison was gone. But the mercury was not in the dye. It had soaked into the heart of the kernel, binding to the proteins of the seed itself. It was invisible, tasteless, and indelible. Driven by hunger and reassured by the cleaning, the farmers did not plant the seed. They milled it. They ground the toxic wheat into flour and baked it into flatbreads, cubs, that they fed to their children, their elders, and their livestock. For weeks, the villagers feasted on the pink wheat. The bread tasted normal. The sheep ate the barley and grew fat. It seemed that the crisis had been averted. But methylmercury is a stalker poison. It has a long latency period. It sits in the body, slowly crossing the blood-brain barrier, accumulating in the central nervous system until it reaches a tipping point. For a month there was silence. Then the horror began. It started with the quieting. Villagers noticed that the birds had stopped singing. Then the cats began to die. Then the sheep, which had eaten the grain, began to stagger and crash into fences, blind and confused. And then the humans. The hospitals in Kirkuk, Baghdad, and Mosul were suddenly flooded with thousands of patients exhibiting the terrifying symptoms of severe neurotoxicity. Men and women walked with the drunken gait of ataxia. They lost their peripheral vision, seeing the world through long, dark tunnels. They lost the ability to speak, reducing grown adults to babbling infants. The scale of the suffering was apocalyptic. Entire families collapsed together. In the rural hamlets, where there were no doctors, people simply lay down in their mud brick homes and waited for the end, their bodies twitching uncontrollably as the mercury dissolved the neural connections that kept them tethered to reality. The government, panicked by the scale of the disaster and the political fallout, made a fatal error. They issued a death penalty for anyone caught possessing the grain. The intent was to stop people from eating it, but the result was that terrified farmers took their remaining sacks of pink wheat and dumped them into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, or fed them to their animals to hide the evidence. This turned a food poisoning crisis into an environmental catastrophe. The mercury that was meant to be buried in the fields was now in the water supply and the meat supply. The fish in the rivers became toxic. The gazelles and sheep became walking reservoirs of poison. The death toll is officially recorded as 459, but experts estimate that the true number is likely 10 times that, with over 6,500 people admitted to hospitals and tens of thousands suffering permanent brain damage. It was a silent massacre, a generation of rural Iraqis maimed by a sack of grain that was meant to save them. The Iraq disaster revealed the terrifying lag time of mercury. It showed us that you can consume a lethal dose and feel fine for weeks, walking around, laughing, working, while the molecules are busy dismantling your brain from the inside. It also exposed the dark side of globalization, the disconnect between the chemist in a lab in Mexico who designs a fungicide and the farmer in a village in Iraq who bakes a loaf of bread. The warning label, the skull and crossbones, the pink dye, these were safety mechanisms designed by lawyers, not humanists. They failed because they did not account for the desperate logic of hunger. The pink harvest remains a haunting reminder that in the complex web of industrial agriculture, a single chemical decision can ripple across the world to become a weapon of mass destruction, delivered not by a bomb, but by the daily bread. In the pristine, climate-controlled silence of the modern laboratory, the ancient fear of alchemy is supposed to be extinct. Here, under the hum of fume hoods and the glare of fluorescent lights, we believe we have tamed the elements, stripping them of their mystical malice and reducing them to data points and predictable reactions. But on August 14, 1996, at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, the heavy silver ghost proved that it had lost none of its lethality. Professor Qin Shi Huang, a brilliant and meticulous toxicologist, was studying the way heavy metals interfere with DNA repair mechanisms. To do this, she needed to use a specific, terrifying compound, dimethylmercury. This is a supertoxic variant, a liquid so dense and volatile that it makes metallic mercury look benign. As she transferred the liquid from one vessel to another, a single, tiny drop, less than half a milliliter, fell from the pipette and landed on the back of her gloved left hand. She was wearing the standard safety gear of the time, latex gloves. She noted the spill, removed the gloves, washed her hands, and continued her work, secure in the belief that the rubber barrier had protected her. She did not know that she was already a dead woman walking. The horror of the Shi Huang case lies in the physics of the molecule. Dimethylmercury is not just toxic, it is lipophilic to a degree that defies intuition. It does not just sit on a surface, it permeates it. Later tests would reveal that the chemical passed through the latex glove in 15 seconds or less, entering her skin and entering her bloodstream almost instantly. But unlike a burn or a cut, there was no pain, no mark, no signal. The assassin was silent. For 5 months, Qin Shi Huang lived a normal life. She taught her classes, spent time with her family, and published her research, unaware that the mercury was slowly migrating through her body, crossing the blood-brain barrier with the ease of a ghost walking through a wall. It was binding to the enzymes in her neurons, dismantling the cellular machinery that allowed her brain to perceive the world. This is the stalker phase of organic mercury poisoning, a terrifying latency where the victim is perfectly healthy while the biological bomb ticks down to zero. The collapse, when it came, was rapid and total. In January 1997, she began to experience tingling in her fingers and toes, followed by slurred speech and difficulties with balance. She thought she was coming down with a virus. Within weeks, she was unable to walk, her vision field narrowed to pinpricks, and she slipped into a vegetative state of profound agitation. The mercury had effectively dissolved the processing centers of her cerebral cortex. Despite aggressive chelation therapy, a chemical attempt to scrub the blood of metals, it was too late. The mercury was not in her blood. It was in her brain, locked inside the fatty tissue where the medicine could not reach. She died a few months later, a martyr to the gap in our knowledge. Her death rewrote the safety protocols of the entire scientific world, proving that even the most expert among us are vulnerable to the single drop lethality of the element we try to master. It was a stark reminder that in the presence of mercury, a layer of latex is as useless as a layer of prayer. But while Qin Shi Huang's death was a rare, high-stakes tragedy of the ivory tower, there is a parallel story of mercury exposure that is far more pedestrian, affecting billions of people in the most intimate setting imaginable. The dentist's chair. This is the saga of the Silver War, a conflict that tore the medical community apart in the 19th century and whose repercussions are still felt every time we open our mouths. For most of human history, a cavity was a sentence of extraction. If a tooth rotted, it was pulled. But in the early 1800s, a French invention arrived in America that promised to save the tooth: amalgam. It was a paste made of silver shavings and liquid mercury that could be pressed into a cavity, where it would harden into a durable silver plug. It was cheap, easy to use, and painless. It was also the catalyst for the first great civil war of American medicine. The protagonists of this chaos were the Crocker brothers, two French charlatans who arrived in New York in 1833. They were not dentists. They were showmen. They set up a lavish office, dressed in velvet, and advertised their royal mineral succedaneum, a fancy name for mercury paste. They denounced the traditional dentists who used painful gold foil to fill teeth as butchers. The public, terrified of pain and attracted by the low price and the royal branding, flocked to the Crockers. The brothers filled thousands of teeth with sloppy mercury paste, often without even cleaning out the decay first. They made a fortune and fled the country just as the consequences began to manifest. Patients' teeth shattered as the amalgam expanded, gums turned black and gangrenous, and many suffered the classic symptoms of systemic mercury poisoning. The dental establishment was horrified. The leading dentists of the time declared amalgam a poison and anyone who used it a quack. This led to the Amalgam War. The American Society of Dental Surgeons, the first professional dental organization, issued a pledge. Any member who refused to sign a contract promising never to use amalgam was expelled. It was a prohibition built on valid toxicological fear, but the economics of mercury were too powerful to suppress. Gold was expensive. Mercury was cheap. The dentists who used amalgam could treat the masses, while the gold-only elitists went bankrupt. In a twist of historical irony, the pro-amalgam faction won. They formed a new organization, the American Dental Association, ADA, which exists today as the governing body of the profession. The ADA was effectively founded on the defense of the mercury filling. For the next 150 years, the silver filling became the gold standard of dentistry, normalizing the practice of drilling a hole in a human bone and filling it with a mixture that is 50% neurotoxin by weight. The dental amalgam is a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance. If you hold a ball of liquid mercury in your hand in a school, the hazmat team is called. If you take that same mercury, mix it with silver powder, and press it into a child's tooth, it is called standard of care. The official stance has always been that the mercury is locked in the alloy and is biologically inert. But modern instruments tell a different story. We now know that every time a person with fillings chews, brushes their teeth, or drinks hot coffee, microscopic vapors of mercury are released. It is a chronic, low-dose fumigation of the oral cavity. While the levels are debated fiercely, with one side claiming they are safe and the other claiming they contribute to chronic illness, the sheer scale of the exposure is staggering. Billions of fillings have been placed. We have turned the mouths of the human population into the largest mercury repository on the planet. The legacy of this practice reaches its grim conclusion not in the dentist's chair, but in the crematorium. When a person with silver fillings dies and is cremated, the fire vaporizes the mercury in their teeth. It shoots up the smokestack and enters the atmosphere, returning to the cycle to rain down on the next generation. In countries like the UK, crematoriums are responsible for a significant percentage of the nation's total mercury emissions. We are quite literally ghosts breathing poison on the living. It is the final act of the amalgam story. Even in death, we cannot hold onto the silver. It escapes the body to haunt the world again, a testament to the decision made in 1833 to prioritize the convenience of the paste over the safety of the patient. The case of the drill teaches us that once a toxin becomes an economic foundation, it is almost impossible to dislodge, protected by institutions that were built to defend it, leaving the public to chew on the consequences for centuries. While the hatters were trembling in their workshops and the dentists were arguing in their parlors, the military powers of the world were quietly harnessing mercury for a purpose that would redefine the very nature of violence. For centuries, the history of warfare was defined by the flintlock. To fire a gun, a piece of flint had to strike a piece of steel, creating a spark that would ignite a pan of powder. It was a clumsy, unreliable mechanics, prone to failure in the rain and slow to reload. But in 1800, an English chemist named Edward Howard discovered a compound that would change the sound of battle forever: mercury fulminate. By dissolving mercury in nitric acid and adding alcohol, he created a white, crystalline salt that was terrifyingly unstable. It did not need fire to explode, it needed only a blow. A sharp tap was enough to cause it to detonate with a violent, supersonic crack. This was the birth of the percussion cap, and subsequently, the modern bullet. Mercury fulminate became the primer of the industrial war machine. It is the tiny bead of sensitive explosive found at the base of every brass cartridge, the chemical match that lights the gunpowder. This innovation meant that war could become rapid, automatic, and relentless. The machine gun, the revolver, and the repeating rifle were all made possible by the unique chemical instability of mercury. In the factories of the 19th and 20th centuries, millions of women, the munitionettes, labored to fill these caps. They worked in silence, handling the white powder with wet hands to prevent sparks, but the mercury was not idle. It was absorbed through their skin and inhaled as dust. These women suffered from powder headaches, tremors, and a chronic wasting sickness that was often dismissed as fatigue. They were the first casualties of the war, dying not in the trenches, but in the assembly lines, their nervous systems sacrificed to ensure that the soldier's rifle would fire without fail. Every gunshot heard in the American Civil War, World War I, and World War II was initiated by a microscopic detonation of mercury, a silver spark that ignited the slaughter of millions. But mercury's role in the 19th century was not limited to the darkness of war. It was also the secret engine of the light that guided ships through the darkness. The great lighthouses of the Victorian era, the stone towers that guarded the treacherous coasts of Scotland, France, and Oregon, relied on a piece of optical technology called the Fresnel lens. These were massive, beehive-shaped structures of crystal glass weighing several tons. To be effective, they had to rotate smoothly and constantly to create the sweeping beam. But a mechanical bearing strong enough to hold the weight would create too much friction. The lens would stutter and jam. The engineers found a solution in the liquid metal. They built troughs of cast iron at the top of the towers and filled them with hundreds of pounds of liquid mercury. The multi-ton lens was then floated on the mercury bath. Because mercury is so dense, the glass floated like a cork, and the friction was so low that a lighthouse keeper could push the entire apparatus with a single finger. This technological triumph, however, created a unique form of solitary confinement. The lighthouse keepers lived in the lantern room at the top of the tower, a small glass-enclosed space that acted as a greenhouse. In the summer, the heat would cause the mercury in the open trough to vaporize. The keepers, often men of few words who were already isolated by geography, were breathing a concentrated atmosphere of neurotoxin night after night. History is filled with tales of the madness of the keepers, stories of men who went insane, jumped from the towers, or vanished into the sea. We have always attributed this to the loneliness, the howling wind, and the relentless crashing of the waves. But toxicology suggests a darker culprit. The hallucinations, the paranoia, and the fantastical visions reported in lighthouse logs align perfectly with the symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning. The beacon that saved the ships was slowly extinguishing the minds of the men who tended it, turning the lighthouse into a beautiful, spinning gas chamber high above the surf. As the world pivoted from steam to electricity, Mercury found yet another vessel to inhabit, one that would place it in the subterranean arteries of the modern city. In the early 20th century, the electrification of subway systems and streetcars required a way to convert the alternating current, AC, from the power plants into the direct current, DC, needed by the train motors. The solution was the mercury arc rectifier. These were devices right out of a science fiction nightmare, massive, bulbous glass octopuses with glowing arms, filled with pools of liquid mercury. When the electricity hit the mercury, it vaporized into a plasma arc, a bridge of conductive blue fire that only allowed power to flow in one direction. These rectifiers were installed in substations deep beneath the streets of New York, London, and Paris. They hummed with a terrifying, ultraviolet energy, glowing with a spectral blue light that looked like the captured soul of a storm. The men who maintained these substations were the trolls of the electric age, working in the dark, hot basements where the air was thick with ozone and mercury vapor. When a rectifier bulb broke, which happened frequently, the liquid metal would spill across the floor, boiling instantly on the hot machinery. The cleanup crews would push it into drains or sweep it up, inhaling the fumes of the accident. These substations remain some of the most contaminated sites in the urban landscape. Behind the brick facades of unassuming buildings in Brooklyn and unsuspecting alleyways in London, the old rectifier pits are still saturated with the heavy metal. We built our mass transit systems on the back of this technology, riding the trains to work every day, unaware that the power moving the wheels was being filtered through a fountain of toxic plasma that was slowly poisoning the underground workforce. This era of the trigger and the beam illustrates the industrial invisibility of mercury. It was the black box element. We saw the beam of the lighthouse, but not the bath it floated on. We heard the crack of the rifle, but not the chemical that caused it. We rode the subway, but never saw the blue-glowing glass bulbs that drove the engine. Mercury was the hidden infrastructure of modernity, the secret lubricant that allowed the gears of war and commerce to turn. It was effective, efficient, and reliable, and for the engineers of the time, that was all that mattered. The biological cost was an externality, a ghost in the ledger that was never tallied until the men began to shake and the keepers began to scream at the empty ocean. The ubiquity of mercury in these high-stakes applications created a cavalier culture around its handling. In schools and universities, students were encouraged to play with it. It was the fun element. Teachers would pour a puddle of Quicksilver onto a desk and let the children push it around with their fingers, watching it break and reform, mesmerized by its refusal to wet the skin. They would dip coins in it to coat them in silver, or drop it down stairwells to watch it shatter into 1,000 rolling stars. We treated a potent neurotoxin as a toy because it didn't burn like acid or explode like gasoline. Its danger was abstract, delayed, and silent. We mistook its lack of immediate violence for safety, a fatal error in risk assessment that allowed the metal to permeate the culture of education and industry alike. We were training a generation to underestimate the very substance that was eroding their cognitive potential. This cavalier attitude extended to the very measuring of the human heart. The sphygmomanometer, the blood pressure cuff, was for a century a mercury column device. Every doctor's office had one on the wall. When the cuff was inflated, the silver column rose. If the device broke, the mercury spilled onto the carpet, where it was often vacuumed up. Vacuuming mercury is the single most dangerous thing one can do with it. The heat and the airflow of the vacuum cleaner turn the liquid instantly into a massive plume of vapor, filling the room with a toxic cloud. Countless clinics and homes were contaminated this way, turning a medical instrument into an environmental hazard. We were measuring our health with a device that, if mishandled, could permanently damage it, a perfect microcosm of our complicated, abusive relationship with the element. If you look at satellite imagery of the Mata de Dios region in the Peruvian Amazon, you will see a scar that looks like a burn mark on the skin of the planet. It is a vast, desolate expanse of beige mud and poisoned water, gnawed out of the most biodiverse rainforest on Earth. This is La Pampa, a lawless city of shanties and sluice boxes, the epicenter of the modern gold rush that is currently pumping tons of mercury into the atmosphere every single day. Here, the timeline of history has collapsed. Men with cell phones and diesel generators are using a mining technology that has not changed since the Roman Empire. They are the garimperos, the artisanal miners, driven by poverty and the soaring global price of gold to tear down the jungle tree by tree, washing the soil with the silver poison to catch the yellow dust. It is a scene of frantic, toxic energy, where the air smells of burning diesel and metallic vapor, and the silence of the rainforest has been replaced by the roar of pumps and the shouts of men dying for a few grams of metal. The mechanics of this ecological suicide are devastatingly simple. The miners dredge up the river sediment, creating a slurry. To capture the gold, they pour liquid mercury directly into 55-gallon drums or plastic buckets filled with the mud. Then, in a ritual that defies all sanity, they climb into the buckets barefoot. They stomp on the toxic sludge for hours, using the pressure of their feet to force the mercury to amalgamate with the gold. The mercury is absorbed directly through the skin of their feet, entering the bloodstream, beginning the slow process of neurological erosion. But the feet are just the beginning. Once they have the amalgam ball, a silvery nugget that looks like aluminium foil, they must separate the gold. They do this by burning it. In open-air shacks, often right next to where they sleep and eat, the miners take a blowtorch to the amalgam. As the blue flame hits the metal, the mercury boils instantly, vaporizing into a thick, invisible cloud that engulfs the miner, his family, and the surrounding jungle. This is the devil's breath. It is estimated that for every gram of gold produced in this region, 3 grams of mercury are released into the environment. The vapor rises into the canopy, condenses on the leaves, and falls with the rain, turning the entire Amazon basin into a toxic sponge. The trees, the insects, the birds, everything is coated in a layer of quicksilver. But the most immediate victims are the uncontacted or semi-contacted indigenous tribes downriver. The Nahua and the Yanomami people, who have lived in harmony with the forest for millennia, are now suffering from a plague they cannot understand. They eat the catfish from the river, the same catfish that have been swimming in the runoff from the mines. Their hair samples show mercury levels that rival the industrial workers of the 19th century. They are being poisoned by a gold rush they are not participating in, their bodies turning into storage vessels for the waste of the global economy. This is not just a local environmental disaster. It is a global crime scene funded by the jewelry markets of New York, London, and Shanghai. The gold from La Pampa is laundered through a complex network of shell companies and refineries. It is mixed with legal gold, melted down, and stamped with official hallmarks. By the time it reaches the display case in a high-end boutique, the mercury is gone and the blood has been washed away. A wedding ring bought in a mall in Chicago may contain atoms of gold that were stomped out by a teenager in Peru who is now shaking with tremors. The supply chain is opaque, designed to sever the link between the beauty of the product and the horror of its origin. We wear the gold as a symbol of love and eternity, unaware that its extraction required the permanent contamination of the lungs of the world. But the horror of the artisanal trade is not confined to the Amazon. Across the ocean, in the islands of Indonesia and the Philippines, the same tragedy plays out with a different, perhaps even more claustrophobic method: compressor mining. Here on the islands of Lombok and Borneo, miners dig vertical shafts into the rock, barely wide enough for a human body, descending up to 40 meters into the dark. To breathe, they bite onto a plastic hose connected to a cheap car tire compressor on the surface. They rely on a friend to keep the engine running. Down in the dark, they chip away at the ore, sending buckets up to be crushed. The crushing takes place in the villages, in ball mills, rotating steel drums that spin day and night, grinding the rock with mercury. The noise is deafening, a constant industrial drone that overlays the sounds of village life. In these villages, the mercury vapor is not just in the mines, it is in the living rooms. The ball mills are often located in the backyards of family homes. The vapor from the refining process drifts through the open windows, settling on the furniture, the food, and the sleeping children. Field studies in these communities have revealed atmospheric mercury levels that are 50 times higher than the World Health Organization's safety limit. These are mercury villages, where the entire population is slowly being gassed. The children born here exhibit the classic signs of congenital Minamata disease, twisted limbs, cognitive delays, and seizures. Yet the grinding continues. The poverty is so absolute, and the lure of the gold so strong, that the poison is accepted as a necessary evil, a tax paid in health for the chance to eat. The psychological toll on these communities is profound. Mercury poisoning is not just a physical ailment, it is a psychiatric one. As the levels rise in the blood of the miners, the madness sets in. Conflicts in the mining camps explode into violence with terrifying frequency. The gold fever is compounded by the chemical paranoia induced by the toxin. It creates a society on the edge of a nervous breakdown, where erratic behavior, depression, and aggression are the norm. The social fabric disintegrates. Men abandon their families, driven by the obsessive need to find more gold to pay for the mercury to find more gold. It is a cycle of addiction, where the substance they use to extract wealth is the same substance that robs them of the capacity to enjoy it. What makes the burning jungle case so difficult to solve is that mercury is the perfect tool for the poor. It is cheap, it is easy to transport, and it requires no electricity or complex technology to use. You can carry a flask of it in your pocket and a blowtorch in your bag, and you are a mining company. It is the democratization of destruction. Efforts to ban it have largely failed because the black market is porous. Mercury is smuggled across borders in shampoo bottles, in hollowed-out statues, in the fuel tanks of trucks. As long as gold has value, mercury will find a way to the mine. The international community sends inspectors and signs treaties. But in the mud of La Pampa and the shafts of Lombok, the laws of economics and chemistry override the laws of nations. We are witnessing a collision between the desire for the ultimate luxury item and the desperate need for survival, with the most toxic element on the periodic table acting as the broker. As we draw the curtain on these case files, we are left with a single, monumental logistical problem that defines the Anthropocene. What do we do with the immortal? We have spent thousands of years digging mercury out of the ground, liberating it from the sulfide bonds of Cinnabar, and refining it into a fluid of pure potential. Now, having realized its malice, we are desperate to put it back. But the earth does not take back its ghosts easily. The final case file is not about a person or an event, but about a place, the high-security purgatory where we attempt to imprison an element for eternity. In the United States, this place is often a converted Department of Defense site or a deep geological repository like the waste isolation pilot plant. In Europe, it is the salt mines of Germany, specifically the Heilbronn salt mine, a subterranean cathedral of white crystal where the industrial sins of the continent are stacked in steel drums. The physics of storage are terrifying. Elemental mercury is heavy, liquid, and corrosive. It cannot be piled up like coal or buried in a landfill like plastic. If the steel container rusts, the mercury leaks. If the temperature rises, the mercury expands and vaporizes. We are forced to turn the liquid back into a solid, a process called stabilization. We mix the mercury with sulfur or selenium to create a black sulfide sludge, essentially trying to artificially recreate the cinnabar we originally destroyed. This black mercury is less volatile, a chemically castrated version of the Quicksilver, but it is still hazardous. We pack this sludge into special flasks, weld them shut, and lower them thousands of feet into the salt rock, banking on the geological stability of the mine to hold for 10,000 years. We are playing a game of deep time, making a bet that our engineering can outlast the natural erosion of the planet. But while we bury the stockpiles, the ocean remembers. The ultimate reservoir of our mercury history is the deep sea. The methylation cycle does not stop when the factory closes. The mercury we dumped in the 19th and 20th centuries is still circulating in the water column, slowly sinking toward the abyss. Scientists have discovered that the deepest trenches of the ocean, the Mariana, the Kermadec, contain amphipods with mercury levels that rival those found in industrial harbors. The poison has reached the bottom of the world. It is being recycled by the benthic organisms, pulled back up into the food web in a relentless vertical churn. This is the legacy mercury, a planetary debt that cannot be paid off. Even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, the mercury currently in the biosphere will continue to cycle for centuries, moving from air to water to soil to blood, a restless spirit that refuses to leave the stage. This persistence forces us to confront the limits of human remediation. We can scrub the smoke from a coal plant, we can filter the water from a factory, but we cannot filter the ocean. We cannot scour the atmosphere. The mercury is now a constituent part of the environment, a background static that we must learn to live with. It has forced a subtle evolution in our biology and our culture. We have had to alter our diets, limiting the consumption of the predators we once prized. We have had to alter our medicine, abandoning the silver tools that defined precision. We have had to alter our burial rites, filtering the smoke of the crematorium. The element has shaped us as much as we have shaped it. The story of mercury is, in the end, a story of hubris. We looked at a substance that defied the laws of solids and liquids, a substance that was beautiful, heavy, and toxic, and we thought we could make it serve us. We used it to find gold, to make hats, to cure syphilis, to detonate bombs, and to light our cities. It gave us the modern world. It extracted the wealth of empires and triggered the weapons of wars. But it exacted a price in neurons and sanity that we are still calculating. It is the silent partner of civilization, the silver shadow that stands behind the gold, the mirror that reflects our vanity and our fragility. As we stand at the entrance of the salt mine, watching the steel doors seal shut on the latest shipment of stabilized waste, we are performing a final act of respect. We are acknowledging that there are things in the earth that are too powerful for us to hold. We are returning the Quicksilver to the dark, closing the circle that began when the first Neolithic hand reached out to touch the red stone. We leave it there in the silence of the deep earth, a sleeping dragon that we pray will never wake again. The age of mercury is over, the age of memory begins.